The Korean New Deal was introduced last year as one of the world's first post-pandemic recovery plans, gaining the interest of many international observers. The New Deal 2.0, now it was introduced a couple of days ago. It consists of 3 pillars: digital, green, and a human New Deal that aims to strengthen digital transformations, low-carbon initiatives, and social safety nets. With South Korea having become the first country in the world to make the transition from a developing to a developed economy this month, can South Korea use this plan and really rebound and create a new future for itself, and also further its contributions and engagement with the world? For this, we speak with Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Reader in International Relations at King's College London and South Korea's first career chair in Europe at the Brussels School of Governance. Very warm welcome to you. So glad to see you in Seoul today. You normally join us from London, but you're here in the country, so welcome. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be in Korea.
We're very happy and lucky to have you. And well, last week, President Moon Jae-in, he announced the 2.0 version of the Korean New Deal. So I really want to know what you think about this whole deal. Do you think it was a significant upgrade?
I think it was on the human component, which maybe the previous deal didn't focus as much, but obviously kids, they have not lost 1 year of education, but it has been tough for them to be having classes online. There's also this rural urban gap in Korea, like many other countries, in terms of educational attainment. So the focus on these areas, I think, is very welcome. Plus, of course, since the New Deal from last year, Korea has committed to become carbon neutral by 2050. And now it really has to press ahead with policies that will allow it to achieve these goals. It is one of many developed countries that is moving into this transition into carbon neutrality over the next 30 years. But now voters are going to ask the president and I think there has been a change in the concrete goal the government is going to achieve 2030, and obviously new goals that will be achieved by 2050 to achieve this carbon neutrality.
Okay, I think we lost part of the audio there, but well, as you mentioned, in the past, the New Deal, it focused really on perhaps digital and the green aspects, but now President Moon, he introduced a 3rd pillar to the deal, a human New Deal, and that really aims to strengthen human capital and social safety net. So what really is the significance of adding this sort of 3rd arm to the New Deal, and especially during President Moon's final year in office?
I think there are 2 components. The first one, if you focus on the Korean welfare state, you could argue that it is less developed than the welfare state that we have, for example, in Europe. And the focus on supporting kids, for example, from non-traditional families, so they can get better childcare, in my view, is a step in the right direction, because Korean society is obviously changing. Plus the second component, which is the focus on education. I think that is very important, because you have the gap between kids who are growing outside of big cities and those who are growing in cities themselves, such as Seoul, Busan, for example. And I think helping those kids that in the past might have been disadvantaged is important. And there is also the component in terms of education on digital skills. And if you look at the Korean economy, has really moved in this direction. And if it wants to remain competitive at the global level, I think the digital skills are essential before going to university, but also once students join universities or technical colleges, which is another focus of the human component of this New Deal.
Right, so it really aims to support their livelihoods and their future prospects in their careers as well. And while the Korean New Deal, it was actually introduced last year, of course, and it was one of the first post-pandemic recovery plans to be launched, and it did gain some attention around the world. So what do you think are some noteworthy aspects of the deal for other governments or international observers?
I think the focus on technology. I think the focus on technology was very important, because it plan was forward-looking. It wasn't only focusing on providing income support to businesses, to workers who, because of the pandemic, obviously are not able to continue their businesses in the way they could before 2019. So that's important, of course. But it was very forward-looking. It was focusing on the industries of the future, semiconductors, biotech, for example. So I think the focus on where the Korean economy is going to be in the next 10, 20.
Sorry, the screen seems to have frozen a little bit there.
So this.
Right. Well, South Korea, it does need a lot of strengthening in human capital because, well, it doesn't have a lot of natural resources or a massive amount of accumulated wealth compared to very established global powers. But it has, though, been trying to contribute to the world with more of its ideas, its development experience, and knowledge sharing on policies. So how do you think it's really been doing on that front?
I think there are two issues here. The first issue is that obviously Korea used to be a developing country. Now it's a developed country. So you see that you have more traditional developed countries in Europe. The US, for example, don't have this experience of transition in a very short period of time. So Korean policies actually are an example, you could argue, to other developing countries that also want to become developed. And the second issue here is that Korea is one of the few developed countries that we have in this part of the world, in East Asia, along with Taiwan, Japan, Singapore. And in that sense, their experience of these countries is not the same as what we had in Western Europe or what you had in North America. They're in a different region in which you have both developed and developing countries. They are very tech-savvy economies, Korea, of course, as well. And I think this focus on technology, on being a part of the world in which you have to trade both closely with developing plus developed countries, in which you have production networks, production chains that span both developed and developing countries, is something that you don't have in other parts of the world necessarily. And I think in this respect, the Korean experience is quite unique.
So South Korea was sort of always in the middle, sort of in the in-between position of very developed and developing economies. And now it's transitioned into a developed economy as the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development made a decision earlier this month. And then with its new sort of status, then what kind of role or what kind of expectations do you think it's going to have to really live up to?
I think there's going to be a clear expectation that the Korean government, this and the future governments, are going to contribute in more to development across the world, in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, even in Latin America, for example, both in terms of expertise, but also financial contributions. I think that there's an expectation that the industrialization experience of South Korea is also going to be used as an example for other parts of the world, that Korean companies that, for example, are outsourcing production, to Central and Eastern Europe as well, that are going to be sharing not only their wealth, but also their expertise. And I think there's also going to be an expectation that we will have, for example, more G7 meetings, meetings in the United Nations, obviously in the G20 as well, which Korea is part of, that Korea is going to be part of discussions and agreements about how to recover from the pandemic, how to fuel economic growth in the future. So I think these expectations are going to be there for South Korea in a way that maybe was not the case in the past, when some countries maybe wanted to hear from South Korea, but it was not necessary to hear its voice. But now there's going to be the expectation that Korea is going to come up with concrete proposals that are going to serve not only the country itself, but the international community.
Well, perhaps South Korea is appearing to become more and more of a promising partner for countries in the West because of, well, the US's pivot towards the Asia-Pacific. But what about Europe? I mean, as the first Korea chair in Europe, what kind of potential do you see for deeper Korea-EU relations beyond the typical, trade and diplomacy?
I think you see similar expectations, actually. So the EU is going to launch its Indo-Pacific strategy this September. there is going to be a consultation process with Korea, both informal but also formal. And Korea is one of four key partners of the European Union in this part of the world, right? Not only that, it is one of only two so-called like-minded partners. It is really Korea and Japan. This means that, of course, on top of economic cooperation, there's going to be cooperation in the area of security, maritime security, digital security, energy security. These are areas in which the European Union is not only going to expect cooperation with South Korea. I would expect it to demand cooperation with South Korea, to say, okay, well, these are areas in which we have similar concerns. What type of resources is Korea going to contribute? Military resources. You were mentioning diplomacy as well. What diplomatic resources is Korea going to contribute? So this is what you're going to see the European Union asking from the Korean government. Plus, on top of that, obviously, there is a multilateral component. The EU is going to cooperate with multilateral platforms in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, and Korea is one of the key voices, right, in these platforms. So the EU is going to ask Korea what is his view, for example, on multilateral cooperation in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asia-Pacific region. Plus, what is the Korean position on China, because the European position is similar to the Korean. China, but there's also cooperation with some areas. There's going to be discussions with Korea for sure.
Right, so a lot of overlapping sort of issues and challenges, and also agendas that they can really work on. And well, perhaps we saw a glimpse of that sort of Korean-European cooperation going on when South Korea and Spain, they upgraded their relations to strategic ties last month when President Moon visited Madrid, becoming the first Korean leader to do so in about 14 years. So what does this all really mean, and what do you see as the common areas that they can really cooperate in?
What I found very interesting about this agreement that both countries signed was the focus on the future again. There was a focus on digital cooperation. There was a focus on how to promote entrepreneurship, startups, small, medium-sized enterprises. So other than the usual cooperation that you would see between both countries in diplomacy, in the United Nations, in security as well, because, for example, both countries cooperate in the Gulf of Aden, in the Indian Ocean more broadly, right? So you see security cooperation. Is this focus on where do we want the Korean and the Spanish economy to be in 10 or 20 years' time? And you see this focus on promoting entrepreneurs that will come up with the ideas of the future. Digital dialogue, as I mentioned, very important for Spain when it comes to discussions with Korea as well. There's also some interest on the Spanish side on Korean investment, right, from the big table that have been investing, for example, in Central Eastern Europe. Could they do the same in Spain? So this emphasis on attracting foreign direct investment from the Korean side into Spain, that was also quite important. Beyond, as I mentioned, the diplomacy and security, because if you look at diplomacy and security, the position of Spain and Korea is very similar. Obviously, they're in both sides of Eurasia, right? One of the on the western side, the other one on the eastern side. But even in spite of the distance, you see that they have similar approaches to multilateralism. They have similar approaches to security areas in which they need to cooperate, maritime security, digital security, so similar to the position of the European Union. And in general, you see similar approaches to the role that diplomacy and cooperation at the multilateral level matters for both of them. And I think this is an area that clearly you're going to see more cooperation moving forward.
And well, since you began your chairship of Korean Studies in 2017, how much of Korea's influence do you think, how much of its soft power do you think has grown? Have perceptions towards the country changed, do you think? And do you think it's continuing to change?
In Europe, definitely, because the big change that you saw coming in first in is with Korea came to Europe. It has come over the past few years, 3, 4, 5 years. So you have seen much more interest on Korean issues, not only from younger people, but politicians in Europe, suddenly realizing, well, there's this cultural superpower that has arrived to Europe that we were not aware of, but many of them actually became aware thanks to their kids actually first, right? Because this is how K-pop, for example, came into Europe through teenagers who were listening to it on YouTube, for example, right? And this has enhanced the reputation of Korea. So, for example, when President Moon visited France some 3 years ago, he came together with BTS, right? And that attracted a lot of attention in France, not only to BTS itself, but to the fact that, the Korean president, of course, with Korean firms as well, who went to France on that occasion, were coming together, right? And when Moon came to Cornwall recently for the G7 summit, G7 plus summit, there was this joke as well, right? I mean, he's coming and people expect K-pop bands to come afterwards. So it actually then enhances the position of Korea because there is more attention to the politics of South Korea because of this. The other big change as well is that we have the FTA between the EU and Korea that was signed in 2010, entered into force in 2011, is the 10th anniversary, and that has attracted much more investment from Korea into Europe. This started only in Central Eastern Europe in the beginning, but now increasingly you see Korean banks, for example, opening offices across Europe. You see many more Korean tourists also going to Europe when it was possible to travel before the pandemic. You see small, medium-sized enterprises looking at European markets as well. So the economic power of Korea coming together with the soft power have combined in Europe to make it a country that people talk more about, right? Because if you are creating jobs, people are going to talk about it and are going to be more interested in your culture as well. And this is what has happened. A big change, for example, in London is Korean restaurants. We used to have the more traditional Korean restaurants, not necessarily all across London, but in some parts of London. But now you see this new Korean cuisine, right, that mixes Korean traditional with other ingredients, for example, becoming very popular. And this is happening across Europe, not only in the UK, which is another form of soft power. And this has come because you see that this cultural power, this Hallyu coming into Europe, together with Korean companies creating jobs in Europe, people have more interest in Korean culture and in Korea as a whole, and they have interest in the cuisine of Korea as well, in a way that maybe in the past wasn't necessarily the case. So these big changes have taken place, and I see it in my teaching as well. Many more students who take my courses. This changes.
So, well, it looks like we're seeing these different political, economic, and also cultural elements really coming together and really creating this sort of recipe for deeper engagement between South Korea and Europe. And it looks like there's a lot of exciting developments to come. And, well, this is where we'll have to end the interview today. But that was Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Reader in International Relations at King's College London and Career Chair at the Brussels School of Governance. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.